As you approach an argument essay, there are several types of arguments that can be made. I go over the types we will be talking about in this class here. This section is companion information to Mr. David Dahl Hansen's YouTube video on the same subject, Argument Types Video. Before we get started, please remember, often argument-based writings contain a mix of some of the different types of arguments. For example, a definition argument could use a personal narrative to help prove one of the supporting reasons. Proposal argument. This type of argument proposes a course of action or solution. For example, we should do X to fix problem Y. For example, to combat childhood obesity, the Texas state legislature should do 1, 2, and 3. Instead of putting trash into overflowing landfills, Los Angeles should burn trash in special incinerators to create electricity, minimizing the viral impact and save money. The rebuttal argument. This type of argument responds to someone else's argument. This can be done in two ways, with a refutation or a counter-argument. A refutation emphasizes the shortcomings of someone else's argument by examining aspects like evidence used, assumptions made, logical fallacies, and so on. For example, the argument made by X is flawed because of the heavily biased sources used, the heavy-handed use of pathos, and the leaps of logic. Counter-argument, on the other hand, presents a counter-argument in response to the argument someone else makes. For example, most people think that X is the main reason behind childhood obesity, but the real reason is Y. Next up, we have the definition argument. Many of the large debates in society hinge on differing definitions of a term or concept. The definitions of life, an adult, marriage, morality, a sport, obscenity, and so on are all examples of this, resulting in a heated debate on topics like abortion, Title IX, assisted suicide, censorship, and others. This kind of argument establishes a key criteria required for whatever is being defined. For example, I could take an abstract argument defining an illegal drug based on the criteria that I see as key. It has to be addictive, as well as physically or psychologically harmful, to make an argument concrete. I could argue that nicotine should be made illegal because it fits the definition of an illegal drug. It is addictive and physically harmful. Next up, we have a causal argument. Notice I said causal, not casual, which is probably what you've read on screen. A causal argument argues that the cause or causes of something. For example, I read a news story recently about a study on the higher suicide rates in some parts of Colorado, and they've explored several potential causes like the altitude's effect on the brain, the relative isolation of parts of the state, particularly in the winter, with the prevalence of guns and other factors. Then we come to the evaluation argument. This type of argument evaluates something based on criteria. This could be a book, a law, a film, a restaurant, a policy, and so forth that is being evaluated. For example, my criteria for a lunch place might be cost, speed, location, and quality of food. But the criteria would change if I were looking for a place to go on a date with my husband. The key here is to figure out what the most important criteria for the chosen evaluation are. Narrative argument. This type of argument tells a story about a person, place, or event in order to make a point. These types of arguments can be a very effective way to humanize an issue. For example, the raw statistics about the casualties of a natural disaster can be very difficult to comprehend, while someone's personal narrative can put a human face on what happened. When looking for narrative arguments, be careful that what you are looking at is actually a narrative argument. An article about something is not automatically a narrative in this specific definition of a narrative. The aforementioned article on suicide in Colorado is not necessarily a narrative. However, if the author begins in the specific story of a person, then that part of the article would be the example of a narrative argument. Basically, don't confuse description or narration with a narrative. In its most common form, if there is a story told about a person and that story is used to make an argument, then it is a narrative argument. Regardless of what type of argument we're using, there are always some questions to ask. What is at stake when making this argument? Who loses and who gains? Who is the opposition and what arguments do they make? What do I want to say about this topic? What are my supporting ideas for this claim? How does this argument work in my chosen audience? For example, are they resistant to my ideas and why?